My name is Elara, and for 67 years, I've believed in a few simple truths: work hard, be honest, and never ever mistake wealth for worth. I built my life on these principles, side by side with my late husband, Richard. We started with nothing but calloused hands and a shared dream, and we built an empire not of gold, but of integrity. I've always preferred the quiet comfort of a simple life, even when our bank account could have afforded a life of screaming luxury. I never felt the need to wear my success on my sleeve. My pride came from my son, Leo, and the values I thought we had instilled in him. But that pride, like a fine piece of glass, was about to be shattered. It happened at a dinner party, one of those glittering, soulless affairs my daughter-in-law, Charlotte, was so fond of. The house was magnificent, a sprawling mansion in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. It was a house I knew well, a house Richard and I had bought years ago, a dream we never got to live in together. Now, it was Charlotte's stage, and I was just a reluctant player. I sat quietly at the long, polished mahogany table, a ghost from a simpler past, surrounded by Charlotte's friends, people who sized you up with a single glance, their smiles as cold as the diamonds on their fingers. The air was thick with forced laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses. I felt like an exhibit in a museum, the quaint old mother. Then, a lull in the conversation. Every eye turned to me. Charlotte, poised at the head of the table, looked down its length, her lips curling into a smug smile. She let the silence hang for a moment before she spoke, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "Elara," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you know, seeing you here, in your simple clothes, it's a bit jarring." She paused for effect. "You honestly look like a beggar who wandered in off the street. This place isn't for people like you." A collective gasp quickly smothered. Her friends exchanged amused, cruel glances. I looked at my son, Leo, seated beside her. He just stared at his plate, his face flushed with shame, but he said nothing. He didn't defend me. In that moment, he was a stranger. Before I could even process the sting of her words, Charlotte made a show of flagging down the private security guard, standing by the door. "Frank," she called out, her voice sharp and authoritative, "could you please escort this woman out? She's making our guests uncomfortable." My heart didn't break. It turned to stone. I stood up slowly, my dignity, my only armor, and walked out without a word. They thought they had humiliated me. They thought they had put the poor old woman in her place. But Charlotte, in her arrogant triumph, had no idea who I really was. She had no idea that the very foundation she stood on, the house she so proudly claimed as her own, was built on a truth that was about to bring her world crashing down. And I was the one holding the hammer. Walking away from that house, the cold night air felt like a slap, waking me from a long, sad dream. The grand oak doors closing behind me, with a heavy, final thud, didn't signify an end, but a beginning. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to understand the life Richard and I built, a life that was the complete antithesis of the hollow spectacle I had just left behind. Richard and I met when we were barely 20. He had a rusty pickup truck and a toolbox. I had a sketchbook full of designs and a fierce determination. We were dreamers with dirt under our fingernails. We started a small construction business, Stone and Sparrow Homes. He was the stone, the solid, unshakable foundation. I was the sparrow, the one who saw the beauty and potential in an empty lot, who could sketch a house that would one day become a home. Our first office was our tiny apartment kitchen, our business meetings held over lukewarm coffee and my burnt toast. We poured every ounce of our energy, every cent we had, into that business. There were years we barely slept, subsisting on hope and the unwavering belief we had in each other. I remember one particularly harsh winter when a big project fell through. We were on the verge of bankruptcy. We sat in our cold truck, watching the snow fall, and Richard took my hand. He looked at me, his eyes tired but full of that familiar fire, and said, "Ellie, we can lose the business, we can lose the house, we can lose everything, but as long as I have you, I'm the richest man in the world." That was the kind of man he was. His wealth was measured in love, loyalty, and integrity, and our hard work paid off. Stone and sparrow homes grew beyond our wildest dreams. We became known for our quality, for our honesty. We built hundreds of homes, entire communities. We became wealthy, but we never let the money change us. We continued to live in our modest, comfortable three-bedroom house in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood. It was the first house we ever built for ourselves, and it held every memory that mattered. We raised Leo there. We taught him how to ride a bike in the driveway and how to treat people with respect at the dinner table. We taught him that the logo on your shirt or the car in your garage meant nothing. What mattered was the character of the person within. When Richard got sick, our world tilted on its axis. The cancer was aggressive, relentless. The last few years were a blur of hospital visits and quiet moments holding his hand, the comfortable silence between us, saying more than words ever could. Before he passed, we made a plan. We had purchased a magnificent property years earlier, a beautiful plot of land, with old-growth trees and a view of the city skyline. It was meant to be our masterpiece, the home we would finally build for ourselves to grow old in, our forever home. Richard, knowing he would never see it built, made me promise I would build it anyway. "Don't let it just be an empty dream, Ellie," he'd whispered, his voice thin. "Live in it for both of us." After he was gone, the silence in our little house was deafening. Every corner held a memory of him. I couldn't bring myself to build our dream home. The thought of living in it alone was a pain I couldn't face. Around that time, Leo announced he was getting married. He brought Charlotte home to meet me. She was beautiful, polished, and ambitious. I saw the way she looked around our simple home, a flicker of something, disdain maybe, in her eyes. She talked about her friends, her social circles, the importance of presentation. I tried to like her, for Leo's sake. I told myself he was happy, and that's all that mattered. They were married in a lavish ceremony that felt more like a business merger than a union of two hearts. Soon after, they started talking about buying a house. Leo, bless his heart, was still practical. He was looking at sensible homes, places they could afford on his salary as a senior manager at my old company. But Charlotte had other ideas. She wanted a statement piece. She wanted the kind of house that would get her into magazines and at the top of every exclusive guest list. One evening, Leo came to me, looking troubled. He explained that Charlotte was unhappy with their options. He was torn, and in a moment of grief-stricken generosity, a moment where I just wanted to see my son happy again, I made a fateful decision. I offered them the land. I told them I would fund the construction of the house Richard and I had designed. I saw it as a way to honor Richard's memory and give my son a future. I oversaw the construction myself, making sure every detail from our original plans was perfect. It was a bittersweet process, a monument to a life I was supposed to have. When it was finished, it was breathtaking. But as soon as Leo and Charlotte moved in, a subtle shift began. The house I had built as a symbol of love and family became Charlotte's gilded stage. It wasn't a home, it was a venue. My visits became less frequent. Charlotte would make passive-aggressive comments about my clothes, my car, my out-of-touch views on life. She slowly, methodically, began to poison Leo's mind against me. She'd say things like, "Your mother just doesn't understand our lifestyle, Leo. It's embarrassing," or "We need to surround ourselves with the right kind of people to get ahead." Leo, caught in the thrall of this new glittering world, started to drift away. He'd cancel our weekly lunches. His calls became shorter, more perfunctory. He was so desperate to keep his wife happy that he was willing to sacrifice the person who had given him everything. The dinner party was the culmination of this slow, painful erosion. As I sat there, listening to Charlotte's cruel friends talk about their recent trips to Monaco and their summer homes in the Hamptons, I felt a profound sense of alienation. I wasn't just an outsider in that house. I was an outsider in my own son's life. Charlotte's insult was carefully calculated. It wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was a public execution. She wanted to sever my ties to Leo completely, to make it clear that I had no place in their new world, and Leo's silence was his complicity. By letting her throw me out, he was making his choice. He chose the glittering cage over the woman who had built it for him. He chose the illusion of status over the reality of love. As I walked out, I didn't just feel the sting of betrayal. I felt the spirit of Richard beside me, his voice a low whisper in my memory. Some people are so poor, all they have is money. Charlotte and Leo had the money, the house, the glamour, but in that moment, they were the poorest people I knew. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I had to teach them the meaning of true wealth, even if it meant tearing their world apart. The key, I realized, was that I had never formally signed the house over to them. In my grief and a subconscious need to protect Richard's legacy, the house remained in the family trust, a trust that I and I alone controlled. They were living on my generosity, and they had just mistaken it for a permanent right. The ride back to my apartment was a blur of city lights streaking past the taxi window. Each light seemed to mock the darkness that had settled in my heart. But it wasn't the darkness of despair. It was the cold, quiet darkness of a coming storm. The tears that pricked my eyes weren't for myself, but for the son I had lost, and for the man Richard had been, a man whose legacy was being tarnished by the very people meant to uphold it. When I stepped into my apartment, the familiar comfort of it wrapped around me like a warm blanket. It was a simple place, filled not with expensive art, but with framed photos of a life well lived. There was Richard and me on our wedding day, young and full of foolish dreams. There was Leo as a boy, missing his 2 front teeth, holding up a finger painting he'd made for me. Every object held a story, a meaning. It was a home, not a showroom. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, my hands steady. The shock had worn off, replaced by a steely resolve. I sat in Richard's old armchair, the worn leather sighing as I sank into it. I could almost hear his voice, practical and calm. "Don't get mad, Ellie. Get smart." He'd always said that. He believed that anger was a wildfire, destructive and directionless, but strategy was a controlled burn, clearing away the dead wood to allow for new growth. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching the sky slowly fade from inky black to a bruised purple, then to a soft, hopeful grey. With the first rays of dawn, my decision was made. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge was petty and hollow. This was about reclaiming my family's soul. It was about teaching a lesson in humility and respect that had been tragically forgotten. It was about honoring my husband. At precisely 9 a.m., I picked up the phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. "David, it's Elara Hale," I said, my voice even and clear. David Davison had been our family lawyer and friend for over 40 years. He'd drafted the paperwork for our first house and the complex contracts for our last skyscraper. He'd sat with us in the hospital, not as a lawyer, but as a friend when Richard was fading. If anyone understood the heart and soul of the Hale family, it was David. "Elara, it's good to hear your voice, though I suspect this isn't a social call," he said, his tone warm but perceptive. "You're right, David," I replied. "I need to see you. It's about the trust. It's about the house." His office was downtown, a classic, old-world space with wood-paneled walls and shelves groaning under the weight of law books. It smelled of old paper and quiet confidence. David, with his silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, was a reassuring presence. He listened intently as I recounted the events of the previous night, his expression shifting from concern to a quiet, simmering indignation on my behalf. I didn't cry. I laid out the facts, my voice never wavering. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, steepling his fingers. "He let her do that?" he finally asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Richard would be," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I know what Richard would be," I said softly. "And that's why I'm here. David, I want to go over the trust agreement for the property, every line, every clause." He pulled the thick file from his cabinet. For the next hour, we pored over the documents. It was all there, just as I remembered. The Richard and Elara Hale Family Trust. It was established years ago, a complex legal instrument designed to protect our assets and our legacy. The deed to the mansion was held exclusively by the trust. I was the sole trustee. In a crucial clause one Richard himself had insisted upon, it stipulated that any beneficiary residing in a trust property must uphold the core family values of respect, integrity, and familial duty. A violation of these values could, at the trustee's discretion, result in the immediate termination of residency rights. It was a moral clause, something Charlotte, in her materialistic worldview, would never have even considered. She saw a house, Richard had seen a home, a legacy, and he had built a fortress around it. Your legal standing is ironclad, Elara, David confirmed, tapping the page with his pen. The house is yours, their right to live there is entirely at your discretion. You can have them removed tomorrow if you wish. No, I said, shaking my head. This can't be a sudden angry act. It has to be methodical. It has to be a lesson, not just a punishment. They need to understand why this is happening. David nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. Get smart, not mad. I like it. So what's the plan? Over the next few weeks we began to quietly and methodically lay the groundwork. It was a campaign waged not with angry phone calls but with discreet legal maneuvers. First, David, on behalf of the trust, sent a formal inquiry to the bank that held the property's line of credit, which was in the trust's name. We requested a full accounting of all expenditures. Charlotte, it turned out, had been using it as her personal slush fund for lavish parties, designer clothes, and extravagant redecorating projects, all under the guise of home maintenance. Next, we contacted the estate management company that handled the landscaping and pool maintenance, services all paid for by the trust. We put them on notice that a change in residency was possible in the near future, and that all contracts would be under review. The final piece was the most personal. I went to the bank and opened a new account. I deposited a substantial sum of money into it. Then I found a small, clean, unassuming two-bedroom apartment for rent in a decent but far from glamorous neighborhood. I paid the first and last month's rent and the security deposit in full. This wasn't about making them homeless. It was about forcing them to start over, to live within their own means, to remember where they came from. Throughout this process, I never once contacted Leo or Charlotte. I let them live in their bubble of ignorant bliss. I imagined Charlotte basking in the glory of her social victory, feeling secure in her palace, believing she had successfully excised the beggar from her perfect life. She had no idea that the ground beneath her feet was crumbling, that the quiet old woman she had so easily dismissed was methodically dismantling her entire world, brick by legal brick. The quiet resolve had taken root, and now it was beginning to grow. The weeks following the dinner party were, for Leo and Charlotte, a golden age of arrogance. From what I heard through the grapevine, old friends of mine who still occasionally crossed paths with Charlotte's circle, my daughter-in-law was more insufferable than ever. She wore her victory over me like a crown. She'd recount the story of putting her meddling mother-in-law in her place at cocktail parties, painting me as a senile, grasping old woman who couldn't accept her son's new life. Each retelling made her seem more powerful, more in control, cementing her status as the untouchable queen of her castle. She threw herself into a frenzy of social climbing. There was a charity gala where she pledged an obscene amount of the trust's money, a polo match where she entertained a minor European royal, and an endless parade of brunches, lunches, and dinners. The house, my house, was constantly featured in the background of her social media posts, a silent, opulent testament to her success. She and Leo even did a feature for a glossy lifestyle magazine titled At Home with the Hales, where Charlotte talked at length about her vision for the home's design and how important it was to create a space that reflected their journey. The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. Leo, meanwhile, was adrift in a sea of denial and guilt. I know my son. I knew the silence on his end wasn't born of malice, but of weakness. A few half-hearted, blocked number calls came to my phone in the late evenings, but they'd hang up after one or two rings. I imagined him, sitting in his sleek, minimalist office in that big house, the weight of his betrayal a knot in his stomach. He'd see the bills from Charlotte's spending sprees, feel a flicker of the practicality I had raised him with, but then Charlotte would walk in, kiss him, and tell him about the important people they needed to impress, and he would push the feeling down. He had chosen this life, and admitting he'd made a mistake would mean confronting his own weakness, a task he wasn't yet ready for. I let them have their hollow victory. I let them build their castle of cards higher and higher, all while I held the table they were building it on. My silence was my most powerful weapon. It lulled them into a false sense of security, making the eventual reckoning all the more impactful. The time for quiet preparation was over. It was time to set the stage for the final act. I couldn't just show up on their doorstep with a lawyer and an eviction notice. That was Charlotte's style, crass and confrontational. Mine had to be different. It had to be imbued with the very sense of family and dignity she had so casually mocked. The perfect opportunity presented itself on the calendar, Richard's birthday. It was a day Leo and I had always spent together, usually by visiting his grave with a flask of his favorite whiskey and sharing stories. Since his marriage to Charlotte, the tradition had been ignored. She had once called it morbid. This year I would reclaim it. I sat down at my small writing desk and wrote 2 invitations by hand on simple, elegant, cream-colored cardstock. The ink from my fountain pen, the one Richard had given me for our 25th anniversary, flowed smoothly across the paper. The invitation read, "Leo and Charlotte, I would like to invite you for a small family gathering at my apartment on the evening of October 15th at 7 p.m. to honor the memory of Richard on his birthday. There are some important family matters I wish to discuss with you both in person. Your presence is expected. Sincerely, Elara." The wording was deliberate. It was an invitation, not a request. Family matters was a hook they couldn't ignore, and your presence is expected was a command cloaked in civility. I sent them via courier, knowing the formal delivery would give it a weight they couldn't easily dismiss. 2 days later, Leo called. His voice was strained, hesitant. "Mom, we got your invitation." "I expected you would," I said, my voice calm and even. "Look, about that night. I wanted to—" I cut him off, not unkindly. "We will have time to discuss everything on the 15th, Leo, everything. Just be there." There was a pause. I could hear Charlotte murmuring in the background. "Is it a trap?" I heard her hiss. Leo came back on the line, his voice flustered. "Okay, Mom, we'll be there." On the evening of October 15th, I prepared my apartment as if for a state visit. I cleaned until every surface shone. I baked a simple apple cake, the recipe Richard's mother had taught me, and the warm scent of cinnamon and cloves filled the small space. I didn't set out fine china, just my everyday dishes. On the coffee table in the living room, I placed a single framed photo of Richard, a candid shot of him laughing, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Beside it, I placed a thick, unassuming manila envelope. At precisely 7 p.m., the doorbell rang. I took a deep, steadying breath and opened it. There they stood, Leo, looking deeply uncomfortable in a suit that seemed too tight around his conscience, and Charlotte, a vision in a silk dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her eyes swept over my humble hallway, a look of undisguised contempt on her face. She was holding a bottle of expensive champagne, a peace offering that was really just another display of wealth. "Hello, Elara," she said, her voice like ice. "You wanted to see us." "Yes," I said, stepping aside. "Come in. Welcome to my home." The contrast between their world and mine had never been more stark. They stepped out of the gilded cage and into my reality. Charlotte looked around my living room, as if she were inspecting a slightly distasteful museum exhibit. She saw simplicity and judged it as poverty. She had no idea she was walking into the most powerful room in the world, because it was the room where the truth lived. The storm had gathered, and it was about to break. They sat on my sofa, Charlotte perched on the edge, as if she were afraid to make full contact with the fabric. Leo sank into the cushions, looking anywhere but at me. The air was thick with unspoken words, with years of resentment and a fresh, open wound. I didn't offer them champagne. Instead, I poured 3 cups of tea and set them on the coffee table, right next to the manila envelope. I let the silence sit for a moment, a heavy blanket over the room. Then I began, my voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight. "Thank you for coming," I started, looking directly at Leo. "Today is your father's birthday. He would have been 71. He loved this time of year. He would have said the air feels full of possibilities." Charlotte shifted impatiently. "Elara, if this is just going to be a trip down memory lane—" "It's more than that, Charlotte," I said, my gaze shifting to her. My tone was not accusatory, but factual. "It's about what memory means. It's about legacy. Your father, Leo, believed that a person's legacy isn't what you leave for people. It's what you leave in people. Values, integrity, a sense of right and wrong." I paused, letting the words sink in. He and I built a life, a business, a family, on those values. We built everything on the idea that respect is not something you demand with money, but something you earn with character. "A lesson," I added, my eyes locking with Charlotte's. "That seems to have been forgotten." Leo had the decency to look ashamed. He stared at his hands, his teacup untouched. Charlotte, however, raised her chin, defiant. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't you?" I asked softly. I reached for the manila envelope. My hands were perfectly steady. "A few weeks ago, at a dinner in a house I built, you called me a beggar. You had me thrown out. You did this in front of my son, who stood by and let it happen. You felt powerful in that moment, I'm sure. You believed that because you lived in a big house and wore expensive clothes, you had worth, and because I didn't, I had none." I slid the envelope across the coffee table. "You made a critical mistake, Charlotte. You judged the book by its cover. You should have read what was inside." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Leo looked up, his expression a mixture of fear and curiosity. With a flick of her wrist, Charlotte opened the clasp and pulled out the contents. The first document was the title deed for the house, her palace, and right there, in clear, irrefutable black and white, was the name of the owner, the Richard and Elara Hale Family Trust. Her face went blank with confusion. She shuffled to the next document, the trust agreement. Her eyes scanned the page, her perfectly manicured finger tracing the lines. She stopped at the section detailing the trustee. There was only one name listed, Elara Hale. I watched the color drain from her face. It was a fascinating thing to observe. The mask of arrogant superiority dissolved in real time, replaced by a ghastly pale shock. She looked at Leo, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. "What is this?" she finally whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "This is some kind of trick." "It's no trick," I said calmly. "It's the truth. The house was never yours, it was never Leo's, it has always, and will always, belong to the trust. A trust that I control completely. You were living there as beneficiaries, guests in my home, on the condition that you upheld the values your father and I held dear." I leaned forward slightly. "And you, Charlotte, with your cruelty and your greed, violated the very spirit of that agreement. And you, Leo," I said, my voice softening with a mother's pain, "by standing by and allowing it to happen, you failed your father's memory. You failed me. But most of all, you failed yourself." Charlotte's shock curdled into rage. She shot to her feet, the documents scattering to the floor. "You manipulative old witch," she shrieked, her voice raw and ugly. "You did this to control us, to hold this over our heads." She whirled on Leo. "Say something. Are you going to let her do this to us, to me?" This was the moment of truth, the final test. Leo looked at his hysterical wife, her beautiful face twisted into a mask of pure fury. He looked at the legal documents lying at her feet. Then his eyes met mine, and in his gaze I saw the boy I had raised finally, painfully, breaking through the surface of the man he had become. The spell was broken. He saw Charlotte not as the glamorous, powerful woman he'd married, but as a hollow, grasping person who had led him so far from himself. He stood up slowly, his shoulders slumping. He looked at Charlotte with a profound, weary sadness. There's nothing to say, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's her house. It was always her house. The fight went out of Charlotte in an instant, replaced by a terrifying silent understanding. She had lost. Completely. I stood up as well, the final act now in motion. This isn't about punishment, I said, my voice regaining its quiet authority. It's about a course correction. You have 30 days to vacate the property. Your things will be put in storage, which I will pay for. I slid a key across the coffee table. I have rented a small apartment for you. It's clean, it's safe, and the first 2 months are paid for. It's a place to start over, a place to learn to live on what you earn, not what you're given, a place to figure out what is actually important. Charlotte stared at the key as if it were a venomous snake. Leo just nodded, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. The door will always be open for you, Leo, I said softly, but you have to find your own way back. You have to decide what kind of man you want to be, the man your father raised, or the man you've become. The following month was a whirlwind of quiet activity. True to my word, I let them pack their personal belongings. I saw the moving trucks from my apartment window. I never went to the house, not once. I gave them their space to dismantle the life they had built on a lie. On the 31st day, David called me. It's done, Elara. They're gone. The keys are with me. That evening, for the first time since Richard's passing, I drove to the house. I walked through the grand empty rooms, my footsteps echoing in the silence. It was no longer a stage for Charlotte's vanity. It was just a house again, waiting to be filled with love and truth. I walked to the large bay window in the living room, looking out at the city lights twinkling below. I didn't feel a sense of triumph or victory. I felt a deep, aching sadness, but also a sliver of hope. Hope that my son, stripped of the gilded cage, would find his way back to the values that truly mattered. I had taken back my house, but my real goal was to hopefully, one day, get back my son. Richard was right. True wealth was never about what you owned. It was about who you were, and the legacy of character you leave behind. And that was a legacy I would fight to protect, no matter the cost.